you're the guy pointing out the elephant in the room here. And
the elephant has no clothes.
Is that how that goes? I was going to talk a little bit to Joe Rogan about this. We ran out of time, but I think you have some. Just listening to you, you could probably speak really eloquently to academia on the difference between the different fields. So, you think there's a difference between science, engineering, and then the humanities in academia in terms of tolerance that they're willing to tolerate? So, from my perspective, I thought computer science and maybe engineering is more tolerant to radical ideas, but that's perhaps innocent of me, because I always, all the battles going on now are a little bit more on the humanities side and gender studies and so on.
Have you seen the American Mathematical Society's publication of an essay called "Get Out the Way"?
I have not. What's
the idea? Is that white men who hold positions within universities in mathematics should vacate their positions so that young black women can take over, something like this.
That's in terms of diversity, which I also want to ask you about, but in terms of diversity of strictly ideas.
Oh, sure.
Do you think, because you're basically saying physics as a community has become a little bit intolerant to some degree to new radical ideas? Or at least you said
well,
that
it's changed a little bit recently, which is that even string theory is now admitting, okay, we don't, this doesn't look very promising in the short term, right? So the question is, what compiles, if you want to take the computer science metaphor, what will get you into a journal? Will you spend your life trying to push some paper into a journal, or will it be accepted easily? What do we know about the characteristics of the submitter, and what gets taken up and what does not? All of these fields are experiencing pressure because no field is performing so brilliantly well that it's revolutionizing our way of speaking and thinking in the ways in which we've become accustomed.
But don't you think, even in theoretical physics, a lot of times, even with theories like string theory, you could speak to this, it does eventually lead to what are the ways that this theory would be testable? And so,
yeah, ultimately, although, look, there's this thing about Popper and the scientific method that's a cancer and a disease in the minds of very smart people. That's not really how most of the stuff gets worked out. It's how it gets checked.
Right,
and there is a dialogue between theory and experiment. But everybody should read Paul Dirac's 1963 Scientific American article, where he it's very interesting. He talks about it as if it was about the Schrodinger equation and Schrodinger's failure to advance his own work because of his failure to account for some phenomena. The key point is that if your theory is a slight bit off, it won't agree with experiment, but it doesn't mean that the theory is actually wrong. But Dirac could as easily have been talking about his own equation, in which he predicted that the electrons should have an antiparticle. And since the only positively charged particle that was known at the time was the proton, Heisenberg pointed out, well, shouldn't your antiparticle, the proton, have the same mass as the electron, and doesn't that invalidate your theory? So I think that Dirac was actually being potentially quite sneaky and talking about the fact that he had been pushed off of his own theory to some extent by Heisenberg. But look, we've fetishized the scientific method and Popper and falsification because it protects us from crazy ideas entering the field. So, it's a question of balancing type 1 and type 2 error. And we were pretty maxed out in one direction.
The opposite of that, let me say what comforts me, sort of biology or engineering, at the end of the day, does the thing work?
Yeah.
You can test the crazies away. The crazy, well, see, now you're saying, but some ideas are truly crazy and some are actually correct. So,
well, there's pre-correct, currently crazy.
Yeah.
Right? And so you don't want to get rid of everybody who's pre-correct and currently crazy. The problem is that we don't have standards in general for trying to determine who has to be put to the sword in terms of their career and who has to be protected as some sort of giant time suck pain in the ass who may change everything.
Do you think that's possible? Creating a mechanism of those selective?
Well, you're not going to like the answer, but here it comes.
Oh, boy.
It has to do with very human elements. We're trying to do this at the level of like rules and fairness. It's not going to work. Because the only thing that really understands this. You ever read the Double Helix?
It's a book?
Oh, you have to read this book. Not only did Jim Watson half discover this three-dimensional structure of DNA, he was also one hell of a writer before he became an ass. He's tried to destroy his own reputation.
I knew about the ass. I didn't know about the good writer. So.
Jim Watson is one of the most important people now living. And as I've said before, Jim Watson is too important a legacy to be left to Jim Watson. That book tells you more about what actually moves the dial. Right? And there's another story about him, which I don't agree with, which is that he stole everything from Rosalind Franklin. I mean, the problems that he had with Rosalind Franklin are real, but we should actually honor that tension in our history by delving into it rather than having a simple solution. Mm-hmm. Jim Watson talks about Francis Crick being a pain in the ass that everybody secretly knew was super brilliant. And there's an encounter between Chargaff, who came up with the equimolar relations between the nucleotides, who should have gotten the structure of DNA, and Watson and Crick. And he talks about missing a shiver in the heartbeat of biology. This stuff is so gorgeous. It just makes you tremble even thinking about it. Look, we know very often who is to be feared, and we need to fund the people that we fear. The people who are wasting our time need to be excluded from the conversation. You see, and maybe we'll make some errors in both directions, but we have known our own people. We know the pains in the asses that might work out. And we know the people who are really just blowhards, who really have very little to contribute most of the time. It's not 100%, but you're not going to get there with rules.
Right. It's using some kind of instinct. I mean, to be honest, I'm going to make you roll your eyes for a second, but and the first time I heard that there is a large community of people who believe the earth is flat, actually made me pause and ask myself the question. Well,
why would there be such a community?
Yeah. Is it possible the earth is flat? So I had to wait a minute. I mean, then you go through a thinking process that I think is really healthy. It ultimately ends up being a geometry thing, I think. It's an interesting thought experiment at the very least.
Well, I do a different version of it. I say, why is this community stable?
Yeah, that's a good way to analyze it.
Well, interesting that whatever we've done has not erased the community. So, they're taking a long shot bet that won't pan out, Maybe we just haven't thought enough about the rationality of the square root of 2, and somebody brilliant will figure it out. Maybe we will eventually land one day on the surface of Jupiter and explore it.